Let me hit record and then go to our slides. For today, we are finishing up on the three main areas of debate at the Constitutional Convention. After the Great Compromise that concerned the Congress and the Three-Fifths Compromise, which dealt with slaves in the South, we want to now deal with the issue about getting the new Constitution ratified. When the Congress, under the Articles of Confederation, called a constitutional convention together, the purpose was to revise and when the delegates were finished, Congress had given them a requirement on how to get it approved. First of all, any revisions had to be submitted to the Congress first and approved by them. And then, once Congress approved it, all 13 states would have to confirm the revision. Remember that under the leadership of Madison, they came up with a whole new government. And they ignored the Congress's requirements on how to ratify it. They did not send the new Constitution to the Congress to look it over first. Instead, they sent the Constitution directly to the states, and they only required that 9 out of the 13 states ratify it. So a big amending to what Congress required of them. On page 39, if you have your books, there's a chart of the 13 states and when they ratified the Constitution. So the Constitution was written in 1787 and sent to the states. In December of that year, states began to ratify it one by one. Delaware was the first state, as you can see. And it took until June 21st, so 7 months, until the 9th state, New Hampshire, ratified it. And so that's when the Constitution became law officially. June of 1788. And then within 1 month, 2 more states came on board. And then it was almost a year and a half later when North Carolina finally ratified it. And then another 7 months before Rhode Island, as the last state, ratified the Constitution. So it's really quite extraordinary to see that our settled form of government right now, I'm sorry, I forgot to show you this. Our settled form of government right now really came about by, of course, we declared our independence from England. We broke away from England. We established the Articles of Confederation, and then the Congress instructed the delegates to revise and then gave them instructions on how to ratify it. And the delegates completely went against those instructions. So they didn't just revise it, they came up with a completely new one, and then they ratified it the way they wanted to. So we were just, our founding fathers, our forefathers, they were a bunch of rebels, right? They just like to go against the governing authorities. Excuse me? Somebody say something? All right. So there was debate about how to ratify it. The Federalists, led by James Madison, they felt like they had put together a good government that would create a strong federal government that could oversee a strong economy, but also that would be restricted from becoming too powerful, and they would not be a danger to state authority or to individual liberty. The Anti-Federalists and these fears of the Anti-Federalists are on page 36 and 37. They were afraid that a new national government would basically just be replacing a British monarchy. And even though a centralized government would not be as far away as England, it would still become a national government that would be distant to the states and their interests, and they would exercise power over the states that would diminish the state's authority. The Anti-Federalists were very concerned because there was no Bill of Rights, and they believed that the federal government, which under the Articles of Confederation had no rights over, or no power over the individual. They feared that with no Bill of Rights, the federal government would trample on the liberties of people. The Anti-Federalists were afraid that with a strong central government, national government, what would happen would be basically an American aristocracy would be formed. That is an upper class of politically elite people who had more money and wealth and prestige. They would be the ones who would basically run the federal government, and they would not be in touch with the common people. That was one of the things that they loved about the Articles of Confederation, was that the state governments were really made up of not just the wealthier ones, but the majority of them being the lower class or middle class people, as we'd call them today, and they could relate better to each other. So the Anti-Federalists were afraid that would be lost. They were worried that the new office of a chief executive, that is the presidency, would become like an American monarchy. And they still had fresh in their minds King George and his tyrannical ways. So they did not want that in America. And then finally, the Anti-Federalists did not want a national government that would be the means for economic cooperation between the states, and also raising money, having taxes to raise money for a strong common defense, a strong national army. Once again, the Anti-Federalists still remembered the British bringing in their armies, their trained militia to basically live in Boston and live in New York, and they didn't like seeing a professional army in their cities because it was a form of oppression and control. The Anti-Federalists were also concerned that the Constitution was opposed to slavery, not completely, but in some degree, and so that they were afraid that it would just be a slippery slope until eventually slavery was outlawed. So you can guess that many of the Anti-Federalists were from the South. We hear a similar argument today with the Second Amendment about gun control. Every time we have one of these mass shootings in America, there's a revival of the talk about gun control, and specifically there needs to be stronger background checks, and we need to outlaw semi-automatic weapons, assault rifles and things like that. And those that are strong supporters of the Second Amendment, they're afraid that if you give up those things, it'll just lead to more and more losing of their rights to bear arms. So that was kind of a similar, the opposition to slavery that they felt was in the Constitution is a similar situation. Here's some more Anti-Federalists, individuals, and Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay were the three main proponents of a Federalist government. Those three men wrote 85 essays called the Federalist Papers, which is easy to find a copy of online for free. There are a few of these papers in the back of your textbook. So eventually, after the ratification of the Constitution, James Madison wrote the initial Bill of Rights, which were the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. Those were written and then ratified in 1791. Now we have about 25 amendments. So there's been 15 added since the first 10. And so this basically is a contract that guarantees rights to individual citizens. The federal government cannot, for example, the First Amendment cannot violate our freedom of expression, our freedom of speech, our freedom of religion. These are individual rights that are guaranteed to all American citizens. So that leads us into chapter 3 as we talk about what federalism is. The key thing to remember is that they were protecting liberty. Liberty is so important to remember. It's one of our core values as Americans. And really, this is kind of a combination of the end of chapter 2 and the first half of chapter 3. So before we jump into federalism, are there any questions on the ratification process? Okay. So our framers believe that government power must be not only limited, but divided so that it cannot threaten the liberty of individuals. This goes back to the foundational right that Jefferson so beautifully wrote down in the Declaration of Independence. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that all men are created equal and that we are endowed with our Creator with certain unalienable rights. So those rights need to be protected. And so in writing a constitution in which the powers are divided, they came up with a form of government known as federalism. Federalism. You need to know about federalism. And it's simply where power is divided, and in our case, between the federal government and the states. So there's 2 levels, and they each have their own powers. They also they both are restricted in their powers, and then there are some powers that kind of overlap. So they share some powers. And the way that our founders limited government was through a system of protections. You'll find these starting on page 40. A system of protections
Okay.
Still there? Okay.
You gotta finish it.
What's that?
Can you repeat what you were saying?
Okay. So a system of protections that would, a system of mechanisms, that's the word I'm looking for, mechanisms that would divide the federalist government, which was comprised of the national government and state governments. It would divide the powers. It would create a government in which both levels, national and state, could function together and both working to protect the rights of individuals. So there are several different types of powers that are a part of a federal system. Exclusive powers, shared or concurrent powers, denied powers, enumerated powers, and implied powers. So we'll talk about these now for the next 20 minutes. And this will basically cover the final half of chapter 2 and the first half of chapter 3. But this graph here shows how, using two circles interlocked, that the national government has delegated powers. And these are spelled out very specifically in the Constitution. They are expressed and implied and inherent powers. We'll talk about those here in a little bit. And whatever is not clearly expressed in the Constitution or clearly enumerated, and it cannot be implied, are denied powers. That is, the national government cannot exercise powers in those areas. In the same way, when the Constitution was first written, the Anti-Federalists were afraid that it was giving too much power to the national government, and they would be able to basically trump the state governments, no pun intended there. So when they did the 10 amendments, the Bill of Rights, the 10th Amendment specifically gives reserved powers to the states. And basically what that is if these powers are not enumerated for the national government and they're not implied, that means they are reserved only for the states. I'll show you some examples here in a little bit. And then where the circles overlap here, that's where the concurrent powers are. That is, they share powers, like both the national and the state have the power to have a police force to enforce the laws and, seize criminals and bring them to justice. So a division of powers. Now, if you want to look on page 41, I'm just going to go through that little chart there. These are the different mechanisms that are in the Constitution to keep the national government from becoming too powerful. So we just talked about the powers, the grants of power and the division of powers. We know that there is I'll go back to those things. We know that there is a separation of powers in the Constitution. You need to know this. French political scientist, philosopher, Montesquieu. Okay, we're back. See, I think this is all a part of what's wrong with the blackboard and stuff. Can you all see this again? You see Baron de Montesquieu?
Yeah.
Okay. So he was a French political philosopher. He believed in the separation of powers. He believed in checks and balances. So he was very admired by our founders. So know who he is. But we basically took his concept of separation of powers, and that's what we have, is the separation of powers into three branches, and then they have checks and balances on each other. You can see there in that chart the separation of powers, the second mechanism that's listed. These political philosophers from Europe, excuse me, let me get a drink here. These political philosophers from Europe, as well as our founders, very, very suspicious of, because of what had happened with the King of England and other monarchs and dictators. They were very, very wary of people becoming, of authority, of leaders becoming tyrannical, and they wanted to protect against that. So that's why these checks and balances, so that no one branch can become all powerful. Now you'll notice in that little chart on page 41, federalism is mentioned as a mechanism, but federalism is kind of the overarching foundation that all these other things are built upon. So you have grants of power, denials of power, separated institutions, the Bill of Rights. That's a mechanism to protect individuals. Judicial review. This is a power granted to the Supreme Court here to review any law that Congress passes. So the Supreme Court can rule a law unconstitutional, and they've done that many times. And we also know that the Supreme Court, which is the Supreme Court of the land, can strike down state laws that they deem unconstitutional. One of the most recent examples is the rights of same-sex couples to get married. Well, beginning in 2003, you had individual state Supreme Courts making it legal. I believe Massachusetts was the first one to begin, Massachusetts and Hawaii in 2003 or 4. And then you slowly had more states make it legal for same-sex couples to get married in those states. You also had several states make laws declaring that only a marriage between a man and a woman was legal. Well, one by one, the Supreme Court struck down those laws, which defined marriage as only between a man and a woman. And then Oklahoma in 2013, our Supreme Court here in Oklahoma voted to make same-sex marriages legal here in Oklahoma. And then in June of 2015, the Supreme Court, in the case of, I just drew a big blank, Obergefell versus Hodges in 2015, they made it a law of the land, or a right. And so every state had to then recognize same-sex marriages. So that's the power of judicial review. It's gotten a lot of controversy from people in Congress saying the Supreme Court is really going beyond their limits, becoming too powerful. We'll continue to hear that probably for the rest of our lives. And then mentioned very briefly up here, another thing that helps our government be limited is that we have elections. This is the power of the people to have an effect on their government. If our leaders that we've elected are not representing us and passing legislation that the people want, we can vote them out at the next election. Any questions?
No, sir.
Here's some of the powers very quickly that the Constitution gives to the federal government and the state government, along with powers denied and then powers that they have together. So the federal government can print money, both paper and coin, which means that the states cannot make their own money. So there's no there's no paper money that Oklahoma prints where we would have some of our old governors on the their pictures on the paper money. If you remember, under the Articles of Confederation, the federal government could not do anything with interstate commerce between the states, but now under the federal government, under the Constitution, the federal government can regulate commerce between states as well as foreign commerce. And so this slide will be posted soon with all the other ones, but it just gives you an idea of what the Constitution grants and denies both the federal government and the state governments. And then here in the middle are the powers that they both have together. So I'm going to move to chapter 3 now, where we'll focus on federalism in the Constitution. And again, I would say that federalism is the foundation, because it simply means that there are two, that the authority, the power, is divided into the federal government, or the national government, and the state governments. Before you had, and this is on page 64, you had mostly governments that were sovereign, which simply means that a king or maybe parliament or a small group of people, which we call an oligarchy, they had all the power. So a sovereign nation, or a nation in which the government is absolutely sovereign, means that the authority resides with one person or one group. So federalism is a type of government that has shared powers, and ours is between the national government and the state government. The powers are called expressed powers and implied powers. These are two of them. There's some more, hold on. The express powers are those that are specifically mentioned in the Constitution. So for example, Article 1, Section 8, There's 17 powers that Congress has, specifically spelled out. So they are expressed very clearly. Then, in Section 8 of Article 1, at the very end, you have this little clause. You need to know this clause. It's called the Necessary and Proper Clause. It says that Congress has the right to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the expressed powers. So what that's saying is there's 17 clear powers that Congress has, but also if there's something that Congress needs to do to carry out these powers, something that is necessary and proper, they can basically create that power. That is an implied power. Does that make sense?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Political scientists and people in government are still arguing about this today. You have people in government like a guy by the name of Rand Paul and his dad, Ron Paul. They are strict constitutionalists. They believe that you follow the Constitution and there should not be any attempt to try to interpret it. Then you have people, and this is where with some of your more radical people today, like maybe AOC, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and others, there's room to interpret what some of the things written, what they mean or what they can mean. So that's still a debate today. Okay. Are y'all still seeing me or the screen?
We're seeing you.
Okay. Now you see it? So that clause is called the that clause is the necessary and proper clause. Another clause that you need to know is the supremacy clause. And basically this clause is more I would say significant than the necessary and proper clause, because this basically sets up that yes, we have a system here where there is a national government and there's state governments, and they both have authorities, they both have powers, but in the end, the Constitution is the supreme law of the land. So, if there's a conflict between any lower law and a higher law, the higher law comes first. Right now, there is significant debate about the many states right now are, right now it is the law in the land that abortion is legal. It's been law since 1973. And that strikes down any state laws against abortions. But what states have been doing here in the last couple of years, and especially since Trump has been elected and he has been keeping his promises to appoint pro-life judges, more and more states are, they're not they're not completely outlawing abortion, but they are taking steps to outlaw some abortions. So like they're passing, for example, a couple of states have made it law that you cannot have an abortion up until the time of birth, which you would think we'd never be talking about that, but actually, I'm sorry, there are states that are trying to allow that. So there are some states already passing laws that would never happen. There are states that are passing laws that would outlaw abortions in the third trimester, and I think even some in the second trimester. So it's going to be interesting to see what happens, because these are going to go to the Supreme Court. There's going to be people who challenge these, and now that Trump has appointed 2 pro-life judges and the Supreme Court leans towards that, it's going to be interesting what happens. And so there are people on the left who are very, very nervous about Roe versus Wade being struck down. But anyway, the supremacy clause is that the U.S. Constitution is the supreme law of the land. The other clause we talked about, necessary and proper clause, that authorizes Congress to make laws so that they can execute the enumerated powers. Very quickly, the 10th Amendment, I mentioned earlier. This is an amendment that basically gives the states the reserved powers. This amendment states that any powers the Constitution does not specifically give to the national government, those powers are reserved for the states and for the people. So we'll end here with this little chart on federalism and the Constitution. So right here, the supremacy clause. The U.S. Constitution is the supreme law of the land. The federal government has specific powers that are expressed in the Constitution. They also have implied powers by the necessary and proper clause, sometimes called the elastic clause. An example is that they created a national bank. But you have the 10th Amendment here, which talks about the reserved powers. Powers that the national government do not have are reserved for the states. Here's some examples: education, law enforcement. And so we see in Oklahoma that we can do education how our state leaders deem it to be so. The federal government cannot come in like we're seeing more and more charter schools. You guys have seen the commercials for Epic charter schools. And more of those schools are cropping up. The federal government cannot come in and say, oh, no, you can't do that. You can only send your children to public schools. The federal government cannot do that. This is a reserved power only for the states. So this is just kind of a little visual of how federalism works within our Constitution between the federal government and the state government. So any questions on that? Is that to me or someone else?
No, we're checking if you're still there. If it's cut out again.
Okay. So basically, we've stopped at page 65. So we're going to cover that at least through the end of chapter 4 on Wednesday. We're going to try to get into chapter 5. Whatever we don't do, I will do a video on chapter 5 along with your study guide that I'll post on Thursday. So if there's no other questions, we will see you Wednesday at 1. Have a great day.